There are places on Earth so quiet, you can almost hear the sand drifting with the wind. There are creatures that spend their entire lives hidden in darkness, and humans have only just discovered them. And there are mysteries that, the deeper you explore, the more beautifully strange this world becomes. Welcome to Relax Story, a place where we do not rush, where things are not loud. We simply slow down for a little while together to explore nature, hidden mysteries, and sometimes a few facts that make you quietly say, "Wait, seriously." Now then, get comfortable. Our journey is about to begin. Beneath tropical forests, draped across ancient limestone, beneath mist-covered karst ridges, where rain has fallen without pause for millions of years, the earth slowly opens into spaces sunlight has never truly reached. Far above the canopy, the surface world stretches like an endless green ocean, limestone towers rising from the jungle like the exposed bones of an ancient planet, while rivers silently disappear into black fractures in the rock long before anyone can see where they continue underground. Across vast karst regions stretching from Southeast Asia to the limestone mountains of Europe and the dry deserts of southern North America, water has spent millions of years carving into carbonate rock, widening tiny fractures into underground rivers, vertical shafts, and immense conduit networks moving silently beneath the surface, like the circulatory system of another world. Most life within these buried stone systems has never seen direct sunlight. It exists beyond the rhythm of day and night, beyond the shifting colors of the canopy above, inside a biosphere sustained by moisture, minerals, groundwater, and the endless patience of geological time. Karst landscapes are not simply terrain. They are living bodies still changing, places where cold water slips through limestone one drop at a time, dissolving stone so slowly it appears motionless within a human lifetime, yet over millions of years opens chambers larger than any cathedral humanity has ever built. The descent begins beneath the canopy itself. Roots emerge through dark, wet soil, gripping the cold limestone walls as if the forest is trying to hold onto the edge of the upper world. The air begins to change. Forest wind fades away. Humidity grows heavier against the skin, and cold currents escaping from cracks in the stone carry the feeling of a depth too vast to imagine. Light still exists here, but it no longer spreads freely. Wet stone absorbs it into soft, distorted reflections, slowly draining the green of the jungle into pale gray. This is the boundary between two biospheres, a twilight zone where surface life begins to lose its dominance. Mosses and algae cling only near the cave entrance, where the final traces of light remain barely strong enough for photosynthesis. Just a few meters deeper, plant growth almost completely disappears. The sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves do not vanish immediately. They stretch into echoes across the damp stone chambers, as though the darkness ahead is slowly absorbing the forest itself. Water dripping from the ceiling becomes louder than birdsong, each drop carrying the feeling of time falling into darkness. No true cave creatures have appeared yet, only traces of an ecosystem waiting farther ahead. A few moths rest motionless against cold rock near the last surviving light. Tiny insects drift through the humid air. Strands of spider silk tremble gently in the currents flowing out from underground. Beneath high stone fractures lie layers of dry guano gathered over years, signs that somewhere deeper in the darkness, bat colonies exist far beyond human sight. Across the wet mud floor are faint dragging marks and footprints nearly erased by water, reminders that nutrients from the upper world still descend through floodwaters, through fallen leaves, carcasses, and the bodies of animals moving between two worlds. Only a few meters farther in, light begins losing all sense of distance. The final reflections quiver faintly across wet limestone before dissolving into the dark ahead. The cave floor reveals thin mud films like wet skin, dead insect wings trapped between stone cracks, condensation droplets hanging in cold chains from the ceiling, and tiny rivulets silently threading across the rock like veins beneath the earth. Looking back toward the cave entrance, the outside world still glows green beneath moving wind and sunlight. But deeper inside, the air has become colder, quieter, stripped of horizons and of any sense that time still moves through day and night. At this threshold, the cave is not yet complete darkness. It feels more like a breath held between two worlds, preserving the final traces of sunlight within its cold stone mouth before allowing them to disappear forever. Just beyond the cave mouth, the world begins narrowing into low, damp corridors where limestone ceilings slowly sink closer to the ground, where moisture clings to every cold surface as though the stone itself is quietly exhaling into the darkness. Thin roots from the forest above push through ancient fractures, slowly searching deeper into the earth, while invisible currents of cold air drift through narrow passages like unseen rivers sliding across the skin. The cave entrance no longer feels like a fixed place. It begins to resemble a massive living organ, an exchange zone between two worlds where surface air and the cold breath of the underground continuously meet in silence. Here, movement in the air is not shaped by wind, but by differences in temperature between day and night, by seasonal pressure changes, by the heavy humidity between the forest outside and the deeper darkness within. The sounds of the surface world begin fading away. No rustling leaves, no distant birds beyond the canopy, only water condensing and falling from the stone ceiling, dull echoes striking wet limestone, and the deep, muted resonance of ancient rock beneath the earth. Tiny droplets reflect weak light across surfaces coated in condensation, making the entire corridor feel as though it is breathing in slow, ancient rhythms beyond ordinary human biology. It is within this transition zone that the first true life of darkness appears, not as mysterious predators, but as small, fragile bodies carrying energy from the outer world into the underground. A cave cricket stands motionless against wet stone, nearly blending into the pale brown limestone stained by moisture. Its long hind legs grip the uneven rock, while its impossibly long antennae sweep continuously through the darkness, sensing the smallest vibrations and the faintest changes in cooled airflow. In this environment, vision slowly loses its value. Movement is understood through vibration, pressure, and tiny disturbances traveling across damp stone. Cave crickets of the Rhaphidophoridae family have lived between two worlds like this for millions of years. During the day, they hide within the cold, humid twilight corridors of caves. At night, they emerge onto the forest floor outside, where layers of decaying leaves spread across fungal threads and organic matter slowly breaking down beneath the humidity of the nocturnal jungle. Near the cave mouth, the forest no longer feels open or bright. The closer it draws to the underground, the softer, darker, and wetter it becomes, as though the subterranean atmosphere is gradually pulling the surface biosphere toward the ancient darkness below. Throughout the night, the cave crickets move through decomposing leaf litter, feeding on fungal films, organic detritus, and microbial matter coating the wet ground. Before daylight returns, they retreat back underground, carrying fungal spores, fragments of decaying vegetation, organic carbon, and countless microscopic organisms across their bodies. Nutrients continue flowing deeper into the cave ecosystem through waste, eggs, carcasses left after predation, and torn fragments of living tissue disappearing into the darkness. Many subterranean ecosystems depend almost entirely on these silent migrations. No sunlight reaches the deeper corridors. No plants survive in absolute darkness. Yet energy continues descending, carried by creatures small enough to remain almost invisible. The cricket slowly returns toward the twilight corridor, mud and fungal spores still clinging to its fragile body. Darkness gradually swallows its silhouette, though its disappearance is not an ending. It is the continuation of an ancient biological exchange older than human memory itself. Near the final traces of light, several moths rest upon cold stone, using the cave entrance as daytime shelter. Small cave beetles gather around dead insects and patches of slowly decaying organic matter, slightly deeper still, near the point where light no longer reaches. A cave orb weaver waits motionless within a nearly invisible web, sensing the world not through vision, but through delicate vibrations moving along strands of silk. The cricket moves closer. The web trembles so faintly it is almost impossible to notice. The spider shifts only a few centimeters within the darkness. No violent chase unfolds, only the silent tension of an ecosystem where every vibration carries the meaning of survival. The cricket stops just in time, changes direction, and disappears farther into the underground, continuing to transport the energy of the surface world into places that will never again see the sun. The cave entrance no longer feels like a boundary between two spaces. It reveals itself instead as a living membrane of the earth, a place where light slowly fades, but biological exchange never truly stops, where life survives through scarcity, transport, and movements so small almost nobody notices them. Farther in, the ceiling begins to move, not with stone, but with wings, and the darkness learns to feed from the sky it can no longer see. The cave passage had now fully left behind the final twilight zone of the surface world. Behind them remained only a distant grey trace, thin as cold ash, resting at the far end of the passage. Too weak now to properly define the idea of day or night. The space began to widen little by little, the stone ceiling slowly rising into vast vaulted chambers, where layers of calcite hung silently overhead like timelines turned to stone millions of years ago. Echoes no longer died quickly as they had near the cave entrance. They stretched farther, drifted longer, and returned more slowly, as if the darkness itself could hold sound longer than the world outside. The air changed before the eyes could fully adjust. It grew slightly warmer, though not with the heat of sunlight. This was a softer warmth, damp, heavy, mixed with ammonia, wet minerals, and the accumulated breath of biological life trapped inside a space almost untouched by wind. Condensation gathered along the calcite ceilings, swelling into slow droplets before falling into the darkness below. The dripping water was no longer alone. Inside the enormous chamber, other sounds had begun to emerge, faint and steady, nearly impossible to separate from the cave itself. The soft friction of folded wings brushing together, tiny claws gripping stone, short, sharp clicks appearing and vanishing like hairline fractures somewhere inside the dark. As the gaze slowly lifted toward the ceiling, the chamber roof at first looked like nothing more than a motionless mass of black stone, a mineral sky suspended overhead. But after several seconds of silence, the texture began to move, not all at once, but in subtle ripples spreading through the darkness, as though the rock itself had started breathing. Thousands of upside-down bodies gradually emerged from the deep shadows. Clusters of bats covered the ceiling so densely that the calcite nearly disappeared behind dark fur and tightly folded wings pressed together within the chamber's thick humidity. They were not creatures that belonged entirely to the cave. Unlike the blind fish and cave shrimp that would appear much deeper below, these bodies still remained connected to the world of the sky. They were troglodytes, animals that used caves as places to rest, breed, hibernate, stabilize body temperature, and escape predators from the surface world. At night, they left the darkness to hunt moths, mosquitoes, termites, and countless flying insects beyond the forest canopy, only to return before dawn to these deep stone chambers beneath the earth. That endless cycle of movement had turned bat colonies into one of the greatest nutrient bridges within cave ecosystems. From the surface above, they carried nitrogen, phosphorus, organic carbon, and partially digested biological matter into the darkness. Energy did not enter the cave through roots or sunlight. It entered through bodies with wings, through guano falling onto the floor, through corpses slowly decomposing in the humidity, through fur parasites, fragments of tissue, and young that never survived the cold season. Entire cave food webs could survive entirely through this silent exchange repeated across thousands of generations. At closer range, the ceiling no longer resembled stone. It looked like an inverted sky made from sleeping bodies. Wing membranes folded like thin black fabric. Moisture gathered around the fur in tiny halos of condensation. Small breathing movements traveled softly from one cluster to another, giving the unsettling feeling that the entire chamber was breathing together in the dark. Then, a few individuals detached themselves from the ceiling. They moved through the darkness with a precision almost impossible for human eyes to understand, never striking the stone columns, never touching the stalactites, never hesitating inside a world completely stripped of light. High-frequency sound pulses continuously left their bodies, bouncing back from every rock surface, every empty space, every tiny movement within the tunnel. Inside these vast chambers, echolocation became a kind of architecture of darkness, where space itself was seen through sound rather than light. Humans could not hear most of that ultrasound. Only the faintest clicks echoed through the chamber, so delicate they sounded like cold stone cracking softly somewhere inside the dark. When the gaze finally lowered toward the cave floor, for the first time since entering the chamber, The ground was no longer only limestone. Dark, wet patches spread beneath the ceiling. Guano had accumulated into soft, damp layers, and in thicker zones of decomposition, a faint warmth rose into the cold cave air. Small beetles gathered around freshly fallen pellets. Tiny mites moved between organic particles like nearly invisible currents. Across nutrient-rich moisture zones, the first thin fungal films had already begun to form, delicate as skin growing from the darkness itself. This was the cave floor's first transformation. Stone was beginning to become a biological processing surface. Guano decomposition generated slight heat, microbial growth, and concentrated nutrient zones capable of sustaining life in a place untouched by sunlight. Another fresh pellet fell from the ceiling above. Almost immediately, tiny arthropods began moving around the impact site, as though the darkness itself had developed its own metabolism. Outside the cave entrance, the final light of dusk was fading behind blue-gray karst ridges. Deep within the chamber, the bat emergence had begun. A stream of black bodies poured from the cave like liquid shadow, endless and unbroken, disappearing into a sky losing its last light. But the true spectacle was not the size of the swarm. It was what remained behind. When the wings left the darkness, the cave still retained the ammonia, body heat, decomposing organic matter, and the entire nutrient base for creatures that would never see the sky. The cave did not feed itself through stone. It survived through bodies still connected to the surface world, leaving their energy behind in the deep darkness underground. Beneath those wings, the cave floor continued to change, and the cave itself, once made only of stone and silence, had now begun to develop an invisible hunger of its own. The final corridors, still connected to the surface, gradually narrowed into long, damp stone fissures, where light no longer entered the cave as a clear flowing stream, but survived only as a pale layer of dust lingering behind broken walls of limestone. The air here had long since become different from the entrance region above. Stable cold rested motionless inside the hollow spaces of the rock, barely changing between day and night, between rainy season and dry season. Humidity clung heavily to rippling layers of calcite, coating the dark fractures with a thin reflective film that quickly disappeared into the surrounding darkness. The sounds that once followed humanity from the surface world were now completely gone. No birds echoed through distant trees outside. No night insects vibrated through the air. No wind moved through the forest. Only the slow rhythm of dripping water remained, echoing far inside the stone. So slow, it resembled the breathing of the ancient cave itself. Looking back toward the entrance, the final patch of light had become nothing more than a distant mark of the outside world, too far away now to offer any sense of warmth. The damp limestone walls absorbed nearly every remaining reflection, stripping light of its shape entirely. Here, darkness was no longer simply the absence of light. It had become an environmental constant, a stable condition coating every surface, every movement, every form of life existing underground. At this boundary, the documentary left behind the world powered by sunlight and entered another biosphere entirely, where energy no longer arrived from the sky above, but from things that fell downward, decayed, were broken apart, and endlessly recycled in near complete silence. Across the wet mud surrounding older guano deposits, small beetles began to appear like slow black movements beneath the cold vapor. They gathered around decomposing insect remains, around soft, rotting moth wings stuck to the sediment, around tiny shell fragments barely recognizable anymore. Many species swept their antennae continuously through the damp air, searching for the chemical traces of decomposition. Some individuals burrowed deeper into layers of aged guano accumulated over countless cycles, where microbial activity had turned the cave floor softer, warmer, and richer in nutrients than the surrounding stone. In this world, decomposition was not the end of life. It was the center of the entire underground biological economy. Every time a beetle crushed a fragment of organic matter, the surface area available for fungal growth expanded further. Bacteria spread along the wet mud. Materials that once belonged to bat wings, insect carcasses, or waste carried from the surface world were gradually broken down into nutrient particles capable of sustaining other forms of life deeper in the darkness. Many karst cave systems survive almost entirely through guano from bat colonies above, through the waste of cave crickets, through organic fragments accidentally carried inward from the surface biosphere. There was no abundance here, no excess. Every nutrient had to be carried in, fall downward, or survive long enough to be reused by something else. Along the edges of fresh guano layers, springtails appeared almost immediately. These tiny creatures fed on fungal films, bacterial growth, and slowly decomposing residue spread across the damp sediment. Cave mites moved around insect carcasses in motions nearly invisible beneath the cold mist. Pale millipedes dragged their colorless bodies slowly across the soft mud, as if even movement itself had to be conserved inside a world where energy had become precious. The cave ecosystem no longer operated on the scale of chambers or underground rivers. It operated on the scale of nutrients. A single fragment of organic material, no larger than a fingernail, could become a feeding zone for dozens of microorganisms. The wet sediment trembled faintly beneath countless movements, too small for human eyes to fully perceive. Decomposition began almost the instant nutrients touched the cave floor. Nothing remained wasted for long in this darkness. Farther below, inside a narrow passage, a cave cricket slowly moved deeper into the shadows with long, delicate steps. Its antennae continuously swept across the wet stone ahead, sensing texture, moisture, and chemical traces in place of vision. It paused near a softer patch of sediment where egg clusters could be left safely within the stable darkness of the cave. Those tiny eggs would eventually become nutrient packets for beetles, mites, and microbial consumers hidden beneath the mud. Even reproduction itself had become a form of energy transport from the surface world deeper into the underground dark. Near a low rock wall coated in damp calcite, the thin web of a cave spider trembled softly. No obvious sound followed. Only a small springtail vanished from the dark sediment below. There was no predator spectacle here, no violent chase, only nutrients changing form inside near total silence. Life quietly consuming life beneath millions of tons of cold stone. Then the passage curved around one final narrow limestone bend. The last trace of entrance light disappeared from view completely. From that moment forward, the surface world no longer existed as a reference point. Time inside the cave was no longer measured by sunrise or sunset. It was measured by dripping cycles echoing far through the dark, by guano layers thickening through each bat breeding season, by the silent rhythms of decomposition beneath wet sediment, by the endless tiny movements beneath the feet, where entire dark economies continued operating without the need for the sun. Beneath the dense colonies of bats hanging high in the darkness above, the cave slowly began to change its own shape. The ceiling almost vanished now into a blackness so vast the human eye could no longer hold on to any real sense of distance. The world below felt different, lower, closer, heavier, as if the full gravity of the underground were gradually settling onto the damp stone floor beneath. Here, the ground was no longer the cold, dry limestone of the outer passages. It had become a living layer of continuous decay, thick with guano, rotting insect remains, wet mineral mud, pale fungal mats, and nutrient-rich sediment gathered through countless migrations of bats moving through the dark. The deeper these sealed nutrient chambers became, the thicker the air felt. Humidity hovered near saturation, clinging to skin like a thin layer of vapor that never truly disappeared. Within the near-total silence, a faint warmth spread quietly upward from the cave floor itself. It did not come from sunlight, nor from magma buried deep beneath the earth, but from decomposition, a process unfolding without interruption for years, centuries, millennia. Ammonia mixed with wet stone and fungal decay until the cave itself seemed to breathe slowly within the ancient dark. In some of the lower hollows, a thin layer of moisture haze trembled almost invisibly above the guano surface, soft enough to resemble breath rising from the earth itself. Every footstep no longer echoed sharply against stone. Sound disappeared into the thick, soft layer beneath, becoming dull and heavy, as though the cave were swallowing movement into itself. And when the eye lowered close to the floor, it became clear that the cave floor was no longer simply geology. It had become a complete biological substrate, a living layer operating slowly inside absolute darkness. In a world without light, guano became the first source of energy for the entire deep cave ecosystem. Inside what seemed like waste existed nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, microbial biomass, and countless fragments of partially digested insects carried down from the surface world above. The thick guano layers trapped heat more effectively than the cold limestone underneath, allowing decomposition to continue generating faint warmth inside a darkness where morning never arrived. Deep caves produced no new energy of their own. There were no forests here, no leaves, no sunlight for photosynthesis. Everything survived by recycling the smallest fragments of nutrients falling from the distant biosphere above. Guano therefore became a kind of chemical sunlight within cave ecology, an invisible light feeding life in a place that had never known day. Even decomposition itself continued producing heat without a single ray of sun. Moisture drifting above the decaying layers moved gently through the still air, giving the entire chamber the feeling of possessing its own breathing rhythm, slow, deep, ancient. Among the decomposing floor, cave cockroaches began to emerge. They did not dart frantically like the species living near humans above ground. Instead, they moved slowly and continuously across the wet substrate. Some belonged to the genus Eublaberus. Others were cave-adapted, periplaneta, living within the tropical cave systems of Southeast Asia. Here they existed as ancient recyclers of darkness. Their cuticles had become thinner in humidity that almost never dropped. Their colors faded into pale yellow or soft brown, sometimes nearly translucent beneath the weak reflections rising from the damp ground. Their long antennae swept constantly across the air and substrate, reading invisible chemical gradients, sensing the slightest airflow and the faintest vibrations passing through the thick guano layer. They did not hunt. There were no violent chases in this world. They consumed guano, fungal films, rotting insect remains, and the dense organic slurry coating the cave floor. In total darkness, their role was not that of predators, but of slow nutrient grinders, breaking matter into smaller particles for mites, fungi, bacteria, and springtails to continue processing deeper within the decomposition chain. Farther away, guano beetles tunneled through layers of decay with different nutrient densities as though searching for the richest remaining currents of energy. Fly larvae clustered inside wet, ammonia-rich nutrient pockets. Cave mites moved across fungal growth and dissolving carcasses. White fungal threads spread across damp guano like living tissue, slowly consuming the floor itself. The entire cave floor now functioned as a complete nutrient cascade, a decomposition engine that moved slowly but never stopped. And whenever a fresh wave of guano drifted softly down from the darkness overhead, the sound was so faint it barely existed within the endless silence of the cave. Yet immediately, nearby creatures began to react. Antennae shifted direction. Tiny bodies turned toward the new nutrient source that had appeared in the dark. For the first time, it became clear that the darkness here was not still at all. The cave was constantly responding, digesting, transforming matter through processes so slow they were nearly invisible to human time. The cave did not create abundance. It sustained life through endless recycling, allowing no fragment of nutrient to go wasted within the deep dark below. Waste became the foundation of survival. Guano was no longer a background detail beneath the bats overhead. It had become the foundation layer of the entire deep cave ecosystem, the center of nutrient cycling, the silent heart of decomposition, keeping the hidden food web alive in a world that had never seen the sun. Where the guano thickens, the darkness no longer waits passively. It begins to hunt. The vast guano pools slowly faded behind, along with the decomposition floors where bacteria, fungal films, and countless dissolving bodies had once made the cave move like an enormous digestive system beneath the earth. The deeper the descent continued, the more the cave began narrowing around itself. Limestone passages tightened until the darkness no longer opened outward like an endless landscape, but instead closed around the body like damp cracks hidden inside some ancient organ sleeping beneath the geological skin of the planet. The ceiling lowered. The stone walls pressed closer together. Wet fissures stretched through limestone like fractures in a body older than the memory of the surface world itself. Thin streams of water slipped through old guano residue, carrying the scent of cold minerals, faint ammonia, and decay that had continued across generations of creatures that never once saw the sun. Condensation coated the rock walls in an almost invisible layer of moisture, only occasionally catching weak light as pale silver streaks before vanishing back into the stable darkness again. The air here barely moved. Airflow had weakened so completely that every breath seemed to remain around the observer's face before dissolving into the thick silence. All reference to the surface world began to disappear. There was no longer day or night, no wind, no sky, only humidity, cold stone, dripping water, and the growing sensation that the entire cave system was slowly becoming the internal anatomy of some vast subterranean organism beyond human understanding. Within those narrow passages, predatory life finally appeared not as brutal rulers of the underground, but as delicate biological instruments shaped by darkness itself to read the smallest movements in the air. Metamonadi clung motionless to wet limestone walls. Tiny Leptonatella spiders nearly dissolved into the color of damp stone. Troglomorphic cast spiders stretched their unnaturally long legs outward, as if their bodies were trying to expand touch itself into the surrounding darkness. Deeper inside, narrow fractures, cave-adapted huntsman spiders moved so slowly their motion was almost impossible to detect with the human eye. Vision had lost its dominance here long ago. Some species still possessed eyes, but far smaller than those of their surface relatives, remnants of a vanished world their ancestors once belonged to. In its place, the body itself had begun speaking another language. Microscopic sensory hairs lining the legs and abdomen trembled before the slightest airflow, the faintest substrate vibration, even the smallest pressure change created when another organism moved through the darkness. Their long legs no longer existed, simply for walking. They had become extensions of an entire sensory system, living antennae constantly reading the cave air. In a world this poor in energy, hunting could not depend on endless pursuit. A failed chase meant energy lost that might take weeks to recover. So cave predators learned survival through stillness, through ambush, through almost mechanical precision stretched across infinite patience. Web strands appeared only when condensation accidentally settled across the thin silk, hidden in darkness. Without the moisture, the webs were nearly invisible to the human eye. A cave spider remained perfectly motionless against the wet limestone wall, so still the observer could barely recognize its presence. Only when a faint airflow drifted through the narrow passage did the sensory hairs tremble softly, like blades of grass beneath an unseen underground current. Far below, a cave cricket crawled slowly along the edge of old guano. It was no longer merely a nutrient carrier between the surface and the cave ecosystem. In this darkness, it became a source of movement itself, a living vibration spreading through the substrate and air. Tiny beetles digging through decomposition layers produced delicate tremors across the limestone floor. Springtails gathered around fungal zones, moving like living dust inside the ancient silence of the cave. The entire ecosystem seemed to function through vibration rather than vision, through pressure change instead of images, through substrate resonance instead of light. Darkness was no longer the absence of sensation. It had become the foundation of an entirely different sensory language. The cave cricket continued moving slowly through the passage. The spider remained perfectly still. Silence stretched so long, it felt as though time itself had stopped between them. Then one strand of web trembled. In less than a second, the spider lunged. There was no loud sound, no prolonged struggle. Only one impossibly fast movement, so precise it was nearly invisible. And then the passage returned immediately to silence, as though nothing had ever happened. Here, the cave had taught its predators that waiting was more effective than searching, stillness more effective than speed, energy more valuable than aggression. The entire deep cave ecosystem had evolved around metabolic restraint, sensory precision, and the survival logic of minimal movement. An empty web drifted within the darkness. Water dripped somewhere far away. Condensation slid slowly down limestone walls. Sounds so faint they almost did not exist began to feel larger than sight itself. The cave did not operate through vision. It operated through tension, through airflow, through vibration, through patience, stretched across millions of years of evolution inside darkness. Darkness was no longer passive. It was listening to every movement inside itself. But deeper below the webs and moving legs, the cave air itself begins to change, thickening with heat, ammonia, and the breath of thousands of unseen bodies. The deeper the descent into the colossal chambers beneath the earth became, the more the surface world seemed to dissolve from human memory, until even the idea of a sky began to feel unfamiliar. The narrow, cold passages from earlier gradually widened into enormous limestone halls, vaulted spaces so high that light could no longer reach them. The ceiling vanished entirely into darkness, not like a hidden surface, but as if the space above itself had been erased from existence. Massive stone formations hung suspended overhead, giving the chamber the feeling of the interior of some ancient living creature, rather than an empty geological structure, a sleeping body buried beneath the crust of the planet. The air changed almost immediately. It no longer carried the dry chill of the outer limestone corridors. Here, it felt warmer, heavier, thicker, as though every breath had to push through a layer of living humidity. Condensation streamed down the walls in thin, shimmering lines hidden within the dark. The ground below was no longer simple stone floor, but a landscape buried beneath dark guano ridges, soft decomposition basins quietly releasing heat, and nutrient mounds stretching outward like organic floodplains built over thousands of years. The cave was no longer silent. From every direction, the darkness produced its own sounds. The faint flutter of bat wings brushing the air, distant echolocation pulses echoing through unseen vaults, the constant dripping of water into the wet substrate below, and the soft, endless impacts of guano falling from the invisible heights above. At first, the human eye could barely tell where stone ended and living bodies began. The ceiling appeared motionless, until the darkness overhead slowly started to move, like a surface breathing in its sleep. Hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of bats clung together in clusters so dense they behaved like a single mass of living biomass. Colonies of Tadarida brasiliensis covered ceiling vaults stretching for kilometers, while Gerophon plicatus formed trembling black layers along deep wall crevices. In warmer regions, Rosettus aegyptiacus gathered into dense colonies, radiating steady heat into the atmosphere. Smaller Myotis grisescens crowded the upper cracks, where humidity approached complete saturation. Their bodies pressed close together to reduce energy loss, stabilize moisture around the colony, and maintain a steady climate within the immense darkness of the chamber. Heat from millions of living creatures raised the temperature of the cave itself, sending invisible convection currents drifting slowly through the air. Their respiration reshaped the atmospheric chemistry of the chamber. Carbon dioxide settled gradually into lower regions. Moisture from millions of breaths mixed with decomposition gases until the air itself felt almost organic. Around the densest clusters, faint heat shimmer sometimes appeared in the darkness, like subtle waves trembling above the ceiling. The entire chamber began to feel less like a cave and more like a gigantic respiratory system operating beneath the earth. From the unseen space above, guano fell continuously. Not violently like rain, not chaotically like collapse, but softly and steadily, like a biological snowfall that never truly ended. Every nutrient pulse from the ceiling immediately triggered movement across the floor below. Guano fly larvae writhed through the warm decomposition layers, accelerating decay until the ground itself seemed quietly alive. Cave cockroaches gathered in glossy black masses around the edges, still holding heat from fresh decomposition. Guano beetles moved slowly between fresh and ancient layers, like scavengers inside some primordial circulatory system. Deeper still, where nutrient flow remained more stable and darkness became nearly absolute, white millipedes crawled silently across ammonia-rich substrate. Across the surface of the damp guano, fungal blooms spread outward in pale veils, like biological mist growing directly from decay itself. The entire cave floor responded to the ceiling above like an ecosystem synchronized by gravity and nutrient weather. Every shift within the bat colonies overhead transformed the world below. Then, in a single moment, thousands of bats moved together at once. The immense chamber instantly filled with layered wing echoes rolling through the darkness as soft pressure waves. The sound did not explode outward violently. It moved through the chamber like an invisible tide. The air vibrated faintly around the human body. Heat currents changed direction. The smell of ammonia intensified for a few brief seconds. Looking down at the cave floor and then back toward the unseen ceiling above, all boundaries began to disappear. Atmosphere, decomposition floor, moisture, respiratory heat, and the massive biomass overhead no longer felt separate from one another. They operated as a single organism, breathing, digesting, recycling organic matter, and sustaining its own climate beneath the earth. At this point, the cave no longer resembled an empty void in stone. It possessed its own climate, its own nutrient weather, its own atmospheric chemistry, its own breathing rhythm, entirely separate from the illuminated surface world above. The viewer no longer felt as though they were standing inside a cave chamber, but inside the biological body of an ancient biosphere that had never truly needed sunlight in order to survive. And farther from the great colonies, where the guano falls less often and the darkness receives almost nothing, life begins to slow itself toward the edge of stillness. At last, the lower layers thick with the smell of bat guano faded behind them, giving way to a network of limestone corridors that felt drier, colder, and quieter, places where the floor was no longer buried beneath the soft decomposition beds of constant decay, where even the air itself felt biologically thinner, as though the darkness here had already consumed nearly every trace of life that once fell from the world above. The massive bat colonies were gone, No more thin layers of wings vibrating through the air. No more tiny pellets of guano falling endlessly, like organic rain, to feed entire ecosystems below. Only long limestone corridors remained, stretching through nearly empty darkness. Silent low nutrient basins rested between ancient cracks in the stone, places where life had not completely vanished, but had slowed so deeply that it nearly blended into the stillness of the cave itself. Across the damp rock floor lay only scattered guano pellets, fragments of old insect, remains nearly dissolved into mineral deposits, faint fungal traces thin enough to resemble white mist clinging to cold stone, and nearly invisible bacterial films slowly spreading along the last surviving gradients of moisture. The soundscape changed as well. The dense living noise from the chambers behind disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence so prolonged it seemed to gain physical weight. Far beneath the earth came only the distant sound of water dripping slowly through stone, occasionally the faint movement of sediment beneath some unseen creature, followed once again by silence stretching endlessly through the underground world. The darkness here was far larger than the amount of life it contained. This was no longer an ecosystem of abundance, no longer a place where organic matter constantly rained down from above to sustain crowded chains of decomposition. This was a biological economy of almost nothing, where every tiny fragment of matter carried survival value lasting days, sometimes weeks, for creatures evolved to live near the absolute minimum limit of energy. Across a damp mineral surface, a pale white millipede slowly emerged from the dark. Its body carried a soft cream coloration, almost translucent beneath the thin layer of water coating the stone. The pale segments stretched outward as though pigment itself had been erased by time long ago. In a world without light, color gradually lost all meaning. Eyes once necessary on the surface slowly shrank away, or disappeared entirely through countless generations of isolation underground. It moved extraordinarily slowly, not the slowness of weakness, but the slowness of perfect biological calculation. Dozens of tiny legs moved in steady rhythm, like a faint breath across the stone, consuming as little energy as possible in a place where every calorie mattered. Its thin antennae never stopped moving, constantly reading faint chemical traces across the mineral surface, sensing microscopic gradients of moisture, following fungal films so thin the human eye could barely detect them. It did not hunt. It did not hurry. No sense of urgency existed within its movements. In caves this deep, life had not evolved to become faster. It had evolved to wait longer. The millipede continued across a thin bacterial film spread over damp stone, absorbing the smallest remaining traces of organic matter within an environment that was nearly empty. The metabolism of troglodytic organisms like these had slowed across millions of years of adaptation, their bodies learning how to survive on almost no energy at all, learning how to stretch every microscopic fragment of matter into more time alive. Farther ahead in the darkness, a cave beetle appeared against the cold limestone floor. Its body was more elongated than its relatives on the surface, its legs thinner, its antennae longer, its wings nearly useless or completely lost after endless generations no longer needing the sky. Its small clouded eyes remained only as remnants of an ancient world its ancestors once knew, It no longer searched through vision. Its antennae slowly swept across stone, sediment, and layers of ancient organic dust, reading the environment through chemistry rather than light. In this absolute darkness, perception no longer came from images, but from microscopic shifts in humidity, mineral scent, and traces of microbial growth spreading across decaying matter. The beetle stopped beside a single isolated guano pellet, resting within the vast stone floor. Nothing dramatic happened. Only a tiny fragment of matter lying silently in the dark. Yet within deep cave ecology, a pellet like this could become the center of an entire ecosystem patch for days to come. From its aging organic surface, thin fungal threads slowly spread outward like tiny white roots searching through wet mineral layers. Small springtails appeared along the edge of the fungal film. Cave mites gradually gathered around the nutrient patch, like living dust moving through slowed time. The millipede passed silently beside the growing fungi, while the cave beetle patiently examined the chemical signals drifting outward from the tiny pellet. The climax here was not action. It was the realization that inside a world of almost total scarcity, even the smallest organic fragment could sustain multiple forms of life at once, could prolong the biological activity of an entire microscopic community hidden within ancient darkness underground. Deep cave life survived not through abundance. It survived through the ability to stretch the biological meaning of every tiny fragment of matter to its absolute limit. Then the darkness expanded once again. The immense scale of the cave swallowed both the millipede and the beetle until they nearly disappeared completely around the tiny fungal patch. The silence now felt deeper than before, heavier, slower, as though time itself beneath the earth had begun to move at the pace of the creatures living there. The cave was still alive, but life itself had slowed toward its lowest possible rhythm. Evolution within the deep cave world no longer moved toward speed, not toward aggression, not toward abundance. It moved toward efficiency, conservation, metabolic patience, and the ability to survive for very long periods within a world where almost nothing existed to waste. And beyond those starving passages, far past the last ecosystems still receiving material from the surface above, the underground waters of the cave were already holding creatures that had not seen the surface of the earth for millions of years. Bodies so ancient they no longer remembered what sunlight had once been. Beyond the dry stone corridors, where the last fragments of guano had long since been ground into dust by cave beetles and pale many-legged bodies crawling slowly across the cold rock floor, the cave system began to change once again. The limestone no longer opened into echoing chambers, but slowly descended beneath still water, where ancient underground rivers threaded through the earth like black veins running through the body of the planet itself. The water here was so cold it barely carried the scent of life at all. It was so clear that the darkness no longer seemed to exist behind it, but dissolved directly within it. The sounds that once ruled the chambers above had vanished completely. No wings beating against the air, no insects scratching softly across stone, no faint drops of guano falling from the ceiling into the deep mud below. Only tiny pressure shifts spreading through the water like invisible touches, currents so weak they were almost impossible to notice, and dim mineral reflections trembling briefly across submerged limestone before disappearing again. The black surface lay still as glass beneath a sky it could no longer reflect. And the deeper the passage descended, the more the sense of space began to collapse. In dry caves, darkness could still be measured through echoes, but inside these flooded tunnels, darkness could no longer be heard. It was felt through the pressure of the water wrapping around the body, through slight changes in the current, through the strange sensation that the entire cave was breathing very slowly beneath the crust of the earth. Then from a deep crack in the limestone, a pale body began to emerge. It did not rush out of the darkness like a predator. There was no sudden movement, no violence. It drifted forward so slowly that for the first few seconds, the body was almost impossible to separate from the water around it. A faint biological shape suspended inside liquid darkness. It was Astyanax mexicanus, the Mexican tetra, a species that had split itself into two entirely different worlds despite sharing the same ancestor. Above ground, populations living in rivers and streams still carried silver eyes that reflected light, bright pigments along their bodies, fast visual responses, and the familiar instinct to move together through open water. But inside the ancient flooded cave systems of Mexico, other populations had passed through countless generations without ever knowing the sun. Gradually, the eyes began to degenerate. Pigment disappeared from the body. Behaviors tied to vision faded away as quietly as a language no longer spoken by anyone. Its body was so pale, it seemed almost translucent beneath the cold water. Thin fins trembled gently with the current, and where eyes had once formed, there was now only smooth, sealed skin, as though the body itself had forgotten light had ever existed. In the world above, eyes are among the most important organs life has ever created. But deep underground, where darkness never ends, maintaining vision slowly becomes a biological cost no longer worth paying. Even as embryos, cave fish still begin forming eyes, like an ancient memory inherited from ancestors that once lived beneath sunlight. But the process stops halfway. Visual tissues slowly break down as the body grows. Melanin vanishes from the pale skin as well, because color no longer protects against light, no longer serves visual communication, no longer carries meaning in a world where no creature truly sees another. This was not a damaged body. It was a body that had stopped holding on to what darkness no longer needed. A microscopic fragment of the organic matter drifted through the water. Almost no movement was visible to human eyes, but the pale body shifted direction immediately. No eye tracking, no violent burst forward, only a subtle adjustment in the angle of its body, precise in a way that felt almost cold. Running along the fish was the hydrodynamic sensory system that fish use to read water, like a surface filled with invisible information. Tiny pressure changes, vibrations as delicate as breathing, the displacement of water around living bodies. All of it traveled across the fish like signals of light inside a world without a sun. The cave fish did not see the water. It read the water. In this total darkness, pressure became image. Current became sound. Movement became a new form of light. Beneath the cold water, thin bacterial films coated submerged limestone like pale living fog. Tiny copepods, fragile amphipods, and nearly transparent cave isopods drifted slowly through the water column, like organic dust, suspended inside an ocean without dawn. Near the deeper sediment, a few juvenile cave shrimp appeared and disappeared quickly into the dark again. The entire ecosystem functioned through movements so small they were nearly invisible, where every disturbance in the water carried the possibility of survival. And the cavefish read those movements not through lost eyes, but through a body reshaped by thousands of generations of darkness. Deep underground, loss is not always decay. Evolution here does not move toward greater complexity, but toward deeper necessity. What no longer serves the darkness slowly disappears. What helps the body survive silence, cold, and starvation remains, refined and stretched across time. The pale fish slowly disappeared into a deeper crack beneath the black limestone. The darkness did not swallow it. It simply returned to the place where its body had been written by darkness long before any human being ever stepped this far beneath the earth. But farther through the water, in older caves, there are creatures whose lives have slowed so deeply that time itself seems to pass around them, rather than through them. Leaving behind the cave systems where bat colonies still left echoes hanging in the air, the narrative descended deeper into another world, where limestone no longer existed as dry mineral walls coated in dust, but dissolved instead into cold water flowing silently beneath the karst landscapes of the Dinaric region, stretching from northeastern Italy through Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and down along the Balkans toward Montenegro. An ancient hydrological labyrinth hidden beneath the Adriatic stone, ranges slowly carved by water across millions of years. Here there was no guano falling from the ceiling anymore. No insects gathering in dense, shifting clouds inside the twilight zone. No wings striking the darkness. Every trace of the surface world seemed to have been absorbed by water long ago. Only cold subterranean streams, rich with limestone, remained, moving so slowly they were almost impossible to perceive, carrying stable oxygen through an environment so poor in nutrients that life had learned to survive through conservation rather than growth. The water inside these chambers felt detached from human time itself. No large bubbles rising from the bottom, no drifting leaves to suggest seasons, no signs of sunrise or dusk. Pale limestone opened through the darkness like forgotten structures beneath the world, while the silence stretched so deeply that even sound itself seemed to slow down. Then near the limestone bottom, a faint shape appeared. At first, it did not look like an animal at all. It resembled a fragment of soft tissue trapped between stone and sediment. A pale pink-white form, nearly translucent beneath the cold water. Only when the external red gills began pulsing gently, like tiny blood vessels opening and closing in the darkness, did it become clear this was a vertebrate, a living body adapted to a rhythm slower than almost any creature encountered in the documentary so far. It was the olm, a salamander living inside the subterranean streams of the Adriatic karst, where light has barely touched most of its existence. Pigment vanished from its body long ago, leaving behind skin pale as flesh that has never seen sunlight. The degenerated eyes beneath the thin skin can still sense weak traces of light, remnants of an older world its ancestors once belonged to. Its small, fragile limbs were never built for speed. They exist only to steady the body between rock and slow-moving water. This creature carries a different form of evolution from most life on the surface. Its body never fully leaves the larval stage. External gills remain throughout its life. The lateral line system continues running along the body to detect vibrations in the water. Its aquatic form never transforms into a land-dwelling salamander, like many of its surface relatives. This is not incomplete development, but a biological decision written by darkness and isolation. In this environment, there is no reason to leave the water, no need for dry land, no need for spring or summer, no cycles of light to trigger metamorphosis. The Om slowly lifted its head, so slowly that the movement resembled a change in water pressure more than muscle motion. No predatory strike, no burst of speed. It read the environment through skin, smell, taste, and through tiny vibrations passing across the lateral line, as though the entire chamber were one enormous sensory surface whispering through the dark. A small crustacean appeared near the edge of the sediment before vanishing behind pale limestone grains. The Om adjusted only slightly, measured and deliberate enough to barely disturb the surrounding water. Inside these nutrient-poor cave streams, every unnecessary movement is wasted energy. Each hunt may be separated by long stretches of emptiness. Every unit of energy must be preserved for as long as possible. And so, the body learned to slow itself down. It matures extremely late, sometimes taking more than a decade before reproduction even begins. It can survive for decades inside the darkness, even outliving generations of humans. Some individuals are believed to survive for over a century within the same water untouched by dawn, where time is not measured by sunrises or changing leaves, but by the patience of limestone and underground rivers. Here, longevity is not a reward. It is adaptation. To live quickly in darkness is dangerous. Constant reproduction is dangerous. Excess movement is dangerous. The Om does not survive the cave ecosystem through dominance or aggression. It survives through reduction, through low consumption, through the ability to slow the rhythm of its own life until it nearly matches the pace of the environment around it. Tiny amphipods, pale isopods, miniature cave shrimp, and aquatic worms gathering near bacterial surfaces provide only rare opportunities for larger life to feed. The entire food web functions like an ecosystem sleeping deeply beneath the earth. Everything is still alive, but alive at a rhythm so slow it almost appears motionless. Then the pale creature slowly drifted back into a dark crevice along the limestone wall. The external gills faded into the cold water. Silence closed behind the small body until the chamber returned to absolute stillness, as though nothing had ever existed there at all. And what remained was not simply the strangeness of a cave animal, but the realization that beneath the earth, time does not disappear. It only moves so slowly that human beings no longer possess the patience to feel it. And in other waters, beneath other continents, the same darkness has written a different body, smaller, sharper, still blind, but hunting through pressure waves in the black. Beneath the dry limestone country of Texas, where the surface still holds the heat of open grasslands and wide prairie winds, another world continues to flow in absolute silence far below Hays County and the San Marcos region, where the Edwards Aquifer spreads like an unseen underground ocean. Here, there are no dry stone corridors like the karst systems of Europe, No hollow darkness echoing with slow drips from cave ceilings. The entire world is submerged in cold, clear, stable water so unchanging that time itself seems to stop moving the way it does above ground. Water fills the ancient limestone fractures, slipping through narrow fissures deep inside the rock, opening into submerged chambers where the current is nearly invisible. No drifting leaves, no light reaching down from above, no reflection of sky across the surface. Only a transparent expanse stretching between pale stone and darkness, where every living thing survives through signals smaller than movement itself. Within those waters lives a creature that almost no longer belongs to the world of light. The Texas blind salamander, Eurychia rathbuni, does not resemble a predator so much as a fragile extension of the ancient aquifer itself. Its body is pale white, nearly stripped of pigment, its skin faintly translucent, as though light once existed inside its distant ancestors before millions of years in darkness slowly erased it away. Its eyes no longer function, leaving behind only two tiny dark spots beneath the skin, the last traces of a sense once necessary in the surface world. Behind its head, soft red external gills spread through the water like drifting veins suspended in darkness. They move constantly with the faint current around its body, drawing oxygen directly from the cold aquifer itself. Its broad, flattened head rests close against the pale limestone floor, perfectly shaped for a world where the smallest disturbance in water can carry everything needed for survival. Because in total darkness, hunting is no longer the art of sight. It becomes the art of reading change. The water inside the aquifer is almost motionless. No obvious turbulence, no loud sound, only tiny pressure shifts moving through the water like invisible breaths from the environment itself. The salamander slowly sweeps its head from side to side, moving so gently it creates almost no disturbance around its own body. It does not search for shape. It does not search for color. It does not wait for light to reflect from prey. It reads pressure waves. A tiny amphipod moves through sediment along the limestone bottom. Farther away, a blind shrimp shifts softly near the edge of a dark pool. Movements so small the human eye would barely notice them. Yet, inside the still water of the cave, every vibration spreads outward as a signal. Every pressure change becomes a trace. The Texas blind salamander turns before the shrimp ever reaches it. There is no moment of visual recognition, no violent predator drama, only the slightest adjustment in the water. And then the pale white body snaps forward in a movement so brief it nearly disappears from perception itself. Then everything becomes silent again. The water settles back into stillness. The salamander rests motionless against the limestone floor as though nothing ever happened. Its red external gills continue their soft movements in the cold water. Tiny particles of sediment drift slowly back toward the bottom. Once again, the aquifer becomes a dark, unmoving void. And in that moment, darkness begins to change the meaning of the world itself. Because this salamander does not see its prey. It only senses the changes the prey creates in the water around it. Darkness does not erase reality. It simply forces reality to speak another language, one where pressure replaces images, flow replaces light, vibration replaces distance, and chemistry replaces color. If the Om is a creature of geological patience and slow time, then the Texas blind salamander is a creature of water as a living sense, a body that reads the world not through sight, but through nearly invisible vibrations spreading through the ancient liquid darkness beneath the earth. And below that salamander, deeper beneath the slow water and pale stone floor, even smaller bodies continue the same ancient lesson, turning antennae, shells, and skin into tools for touching the tiny fraction of the world darkness still allows them to feel. Beneath the deep limestone layers of Mammoth Cave, where groundwater moves through stone like an ancient memory that has never once seen the sun, narrow cave streams continue winding through absolute darkness. Submerged limestone shelves lie silent beneath cold water. Shallow rock pools stretch through passages lined with fine sediment, and the current moves so slowly that the water no longer feels like motion at all, but like an endless liquid space, quietly existing beneath the earth. No sky reflects across its surface. No shifting light dances across the cave ceiling. Only deep, transparent darkness, where every movement has been slowed by thousands of years of energy scarcity. Across the soft sediment around the pools, microbial films spread in layers almost too thin to see. Fine organic dust settles through the water like pale ash. Tiny bacterial growths continue spreading across wet limestone, absorbing every trace of material carried down from the surface world. Here, nutrients do not arrive as fallen leaves or animal remains. They arrive as dissolved organic matter carried through rainwater seeping into the earth. They arrive in short flood pulses after distant storms far above the surface. Microscopic fungal particles, fragments of debris, and dissolved carbon drift quietly through the cave streams before settling inside these low-energy pools like rare biological events suspended in endless darkness. Along the stone coated in microbial film, the Kentucky cave shrimp begins to appear. Palamonia scanteri barely seems to possess a solid form at all. Its body is colorless, nearly transparent, only slightly longer than an inch. So delicate it feels as though the water itself is temporarily holding it together before allowing it to dissolve back into darkness again. Its eyes disappeared from the species long ago. No sign of vision remains anywhere on its pale shell. Its entire life unfolds inside this cold, stable cave water, where some individuals may survive for more than a decade without ever encountering light. Near the bottom of a limestone shelf, the cave shrimp does not chase anything. It moves in soft, energy-saving motions, while two pairs of antennules continuously spread forward, like delicate sensory branches, reading the chemistry of the water itself. They touch the substrate. They taste dissolved traces drifting in the current. They detect microbial growth coating the stone, microscopic fungi, and protozoans feeding across organic layers so thin the human eye can barely perceive them. Those antennules are what allow the cave shrimp to exist in this darkness. Its body nearly disappears into the water, yet the tiny motions of its antennae continue sweeping through the liquid space around the stone floor, as though the water itself were slowly searching through its own depths. Farther within the rock pool, a mammoth cave crayfish slowly crosses the pale sediment. Larger than the shrimp, its pale white shell emerges faintly through the darkness, partly translucent, carrying the strange fragility of a creature that has lived too long without light. Its reduced eyes are almost useless now. Its front claws open carefully along the bottom of the pool, not like weapons for violent hunting, but like sensory tools, probing stone and sediment in the still water. Every movement the cave crayfish makes is deliberate and slow. There is no explosive burst of energy like crayfish living on the surface. Inside this underground stream, every calorie matters. A faint displacement spreads through the water as it moves across the pool. The pressure shifts for only a moment, but enough for a nearby cave shrimp to retreat into a narrow crack before the crayfish ever reaches it. No pursuit, no violent predator sequence. Only an entire pool quietly adjusting to the smallest change in pressure. Throughout the cave stream, cave snails continue leaving thin feeding trails across microbial films coating the wet limestone. Pale, flattened aquatic isopods slowly crawl along the sediment edges, like drifting fragments suspended between stone and water. Beneath the limits of human perception, protozoa and microbial mats continue growing across the tiny nutrients carried inward by the current. The entire cave water system becomes a silent conveyor of molecules, organic dust, and dissolved carbon. Every level of this underground food web responds to arrivals far smaller than what the surface world would ever recognize as food. A microscopic organic fragment drifts into the pool along an almost invisible current. In the silence, shrimp shift the direction of their antennae. Isopods slowly gather along the sediment edge. Snails move across bacterial films. Microbial growth thickens around the new nutrient source. The climax of this world is not found in pursuit. It exists inside a nutrient event so small that no surface-dwelling eye would ever have the patience to notice it. A nearly invisible fragment of matter can cause an entire underground ecosystem to change behavior at once. Cave aquatic life does not merely survive in darkness. It synchronizes itself with the chemistry of water, with microbial growth, dissolved nutrients, and microscopic scarcity stretching across thousands of years. Vision disappeared from fish, salamanders, shrimp, and crayfish long ago, yet the cave never made them numb to the world around them. It simply replaced sight with thousands of smaller ways to touch reality through antennae, shells, pressure, chemistry, and touch itself. The silent languages of life still moving through the deep, dark water beneath the stone. The cold, karst waters of the Dinaric region slowly merged into the flooded fissures beneath Texas. The deep cave streams of Mammoth Cave stretched onward into limestone pools where Mexican cave fish drifted through pale white darkness. Geographic distance began to lose its meaning. Cave systems separated by oceans, climates, and continents no longer felt like isolated places, but like different expressions of the same invisible force that had been quietly shaping life beneath the earth for millions of years. Darkness. Inside the long isolation of the cave systems, evolution began moving in strangely repetitive directions. Creatures from entirely different branches of life slowly developed the same features, as if darkness itself were rewriting biology in the same language everywhere underground. Troglobites that spent their entire lives inside caves continued losing pigmentation across generations. Eyes shrank, then disappeared. Metabolisms slowed. Bodies learned to survive on the smallest fragments of energy with a patience the surface world had almost forgotten how to sustain. Deep underground, eyes no longer carried a clear ecological payoff. There was no light to read the horizon, no color to separate shapes, no sun turning vision into a survival advantage. Over immense stretches of time, darkness slowly transformed sight into something too expensive for an energy-poor world to maintain. Among the cave fish of Mexico, underground populations gradually developed smaller eyes than their surface ancestors. Pigment faded from their pale white bodies. Across other cave systems, shrimp, salamanders, and arthropods repeated the same evolutionary path. Color no longer mattered for camouflage among trees or bright stone. Pigment no longer mattered for protection against ultraviolet radiation that never reached cave water. Visual signals once essential on the surface slowly became meaningless inside permanent darkness. And so pale, translucent, almost invisible bodies continued appearing again and again beneath the rock. But darkness did not only take away, it also replaced. As vision declined, other senses expanded into the empty space it left behind. Cavefish read water displacement through the lateral line running along their bodies, detecting pressure changes so subtle that the surrounding water almost became an extension of the nervous system itself. Salamanders beneath the Texas aquifers hunted through vibration and chemistry more than imagery. Kentucky cave shrimp swept their antennules through the current to touch, taste, and smell nutrient traces dissolved in the water. Cave crayfish use claws and body contact to probe the dark substrate beneath underground pools. Olms remained nearly motionless in cold cast water, yet still sensed tiny environmental shifts through mechanoreception, smell, and faint signals moving through the underground currents. In many cave species, the loss of eyes no longer resembled simple degeneration. It felt more like a redistribution of perception. As vision faded, sensitivity to vibration and pressure intensified, as though evolution were redirecting biological resources away from light and investing entirely in darkness. Blind cavefish changed direction from the smallest disturbance spreading through the water. No eye tracking, only pressure reading. Olms rested, nearly motionless beneath the stone, external red gills drifting softly like submerged roots. Bodies stretched through time by metabolic minimalism and almost absolute energy conservation. Texas blind salamanders did not see prey. They read pressure signatures moving through aquifers as though the water itself were revealing hidden motion from within. Kentucky cave shrimp continued brushing their antennules across submerged rock, grazing microbial films almost invisible to human perception. Cave crayfish moved slowly through sediment pools, linking grazer layers to predator layers inside the underground food web through the faintest disturbances traveling across dark water. And gradually, a deeper realization began emerging from all those pale white bodies. Darkness did not only remove sight, it removed the need for appearance itself. Color vanished, eyes vanished, speed slowed. Traits once critical in the world of light slowly became unnecessary underground. The body was no longer shaped to be seen. It became a stripped-down instrument for chemistry, vibration, pressure, and touch. A biological form worn down to only what survival inside darkness still required. But cave life was never empty. It was simply written in another sensory language, one without horizons, without sunlight, without color. Yet where predation still continued, Reproduction still continued, adaptation still continued, and evolutionary continuity kept flowing quietly through water, stone, and the ancient darkness beneath the human world. And yet even those pale bodies still depended, in distant ways, on fragments of material falling down from the surface world. Deeper still, inside caves heavy with sulfur and acid, life began separating itself from sunlight almost entirely, while darkness slowly learned how to feed itself through chemistry alone. The groundwater flowing through earlier cave systems still carried distant memories of the surface world, carrying fallen leaves, dead organisms, and drifting organic debris from the land above. But deeper underground, there were chambers where that connection slowly weakened, places where darkness no longer survived on what fell from above, but gradually learned to sustain itself through ancient chemistry, moving silently inside the stone. The air changed before the caves themselves came into view. It grew hotter, heavier, denser against the lungs, carrying the sharp, damp scent of sulfur, as though the earth were slowly exhaling a gas that had never belonged to the human world. In sulfur cave systems buried deep beneath Romania, Italy, and Mexico, darkness was no longer simply the absence of light. It became a biochemical atmosphere where vapor, acid, and minerals blended into an environment almost hostile to mammalian lungs. Hydrogen sulfide continuously rose from groundwater beneath the limestone. Oxygen levels inside these chambers were far lower than surface air, while the water remained rich with sulfide, methane, and ammonia to the point where every breath felt borrowed from another planet. Underground pools rested motionless inside thick black darkness, only occasionally releasing small sulfur bubbles that dissolved slowly across the water's surface. Weak light reflecting down there never truly illuminated the pools. It only revealed water so dark it seemed to absorb color itself. The cave walls slowly abandoned the familiar appearance of limestone. They became covered in soft white slime, wet like living tissue spreading across the rock. Pale sulfur stains streamed down cracks and ceilings, while acidic condensation dripped endlessly through the chambers, cold enough to erode carbonate rock over immense stretches of time. In sulfuric acid caves like these, the acid produced through hydrogen sulfide oxidation continued dissolving the bedrock itself, widening chambers and passages through a morphology entirely different from cave systems formed by rainwater and carbonic acid. The stone here was not simply being worn away by water. It was being slowly rewritten by living chemistry. A thin mist drifted through the chambers. Weak light passing through the vapor failed to push darkness back. It only revealed microbial films stretched across the cave walls like chemical skin. Everything was wet, everything dripped, even silence itself felt thicker here, as though sound struggled to travel through sulfur-rich air. And within that world, the most important organisms were not fish, salamanders, or anything humans could easily see. The primary producers of darkness were sulfur-oxidizing bacteria, nearly invisible microbial communities drawing energy from chemical reactions instead of photosynthesis. They needed no sunlight. They fed on the oxidation of sulfur compounds, methane, and ammonia rising from hot groundwater beneath the earth. In absolute darkness, where no canopy, chlorophyll, or cycle of day and night existed, microbial life still continued building biomass through pure chemistry. Bacteria were no longer background microscopic life. They became the foundation of the entire food web. White microbial mats spread across whetstone, trembling faintly in nearly motionless water. Tiny arthropods crawled slowly across the soft slime. Cave isopods, nematodes, protozoa, and sulfur-adapted invertebrates grazed upon bacterial biomass like ancient herds feeding across a field created not by sunlight, but by chemistry itself. They lived inside wet sediment, biofilm layers, and acid-covered cracks where every surface breathed out the cold, heavy scent of sulfur. Many of these species existed nowhere else on Earth. They evolved in isolation for so long that entire ecosystems slowly became biospheres nearly detached from the surface world. Here, toxicity no longer meant danger alone. The same chemicals capable of killing surface organisms became the first energy source sustaining life underground. Hydrogen sulfide, with its thick, rotten egg odor hanging in the air, formed the chemical foundation for microbial biomass in darkness. Along some cave walls, pale microbial veils hung downward like wet tissue, while acidic slime with extremely low pH slowly dripped from the ceiling like living acid. And gradually, a realization emerged as slowly as the groundwater beneath the stone itself. The sun was no longer the universal center of biology. Darkness here was not emptiness. It was a complete biochemical world where sulfur, acid, microbes, and stone together sustained an ecosystem so ancient it resembled a memory from the earliest Earth, when the first life may also have survived among chemically rich hot waters long before forests, animals, or blue skies existed above the surface. And once chemistry becomes food, the cave no longer behaves like a hidden part of the surface world. It becomes something older, slower, and far more alien. The deeper the descent through those sulfur-soaked corridors, the less the cave feels like an ordinary geological void. The air grows hotter, heavier, thick with moisture dense enough that every breath carries the faint metallic taste of dissolved sulfur drifting through the vapor. Stagnant basins emerge from the darkness like pools of liquid belonging to a world far older than the modern Earth. The water is black, almost incapable of reflecting light. Across its surface, thin sulfur films shimmer with the dull sheen of spilled oil, while microbial rafts drift silently like fragments of living tissue floating across the body of some sleeping giant. Along the wet rock walls, bacterial mats spread in soft layers of pale silver and muted yellow, trembling almost imperceptibly, with the tiny currents threading through cracks deeper below. Very little large movement survives inside this chamber. No rushing water, no chaotic beating of wings, only the exchange of matter unfolding at a pace too slow for human eyes to fully register. Sulfur vapor rises from the dark pools, condensing into acidic moisture across the low ceiling before dripping back onto the stone in slow, rhythmic pulses like the circulation of some ancient underground organ. The entire cave begins to resemble a biochemical body, more than a chamber of rock. It exchanges gas, minerals, and chemical energy in absolute darkness, where life no longer depends on the sky above. Inside sulfur cave systems like these, microbial communities evolved around a completely different logic from the surface world. No photosynthesis exists here. No forests absorbing sunlight to form the foundation of a food chain. Instead, microscopic chemolitho-autotrophic microbes coating the sulfur-rich stone become the primary producers of the entire ecosystem. They pull energy from the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide and other reduced sulfur compounds, converting inorganic carbon into organic matter without needing a single ray of light. What plants accomplish with sunlight on the surface, sulfur-oxidizing bacteria achieve here through chemistry alone. Under macro view, the bacterial mats spread across the sulfur-coated stone resemble living snow, breathing in slow motion. Their texture looks soft and wet, like biological skin stretched across ancient geology. Thin white slime pulses gently with nearly motionless currents, while tiny gas bubbles remain trapped beneath the microbial layers like breath caught inside a body with no lungs. Occasionally, a sulfur bubble escapes from the black water below, sending slow ripples across the surface before vanishing again into darkness. The entire chamber moves through chemistry rather than muscle, through molecular reactions instead of animal motion. Some microbial mats hang downward in thin gelatinous veils, stretching from the ceiling into the water like translucent living membranes. Their colors shift between faded white, silver gray, and muted sulfur yellow. Deeper within the dark water column, suspended bacterial colonies drift like microscopic clouds that never disperse. The water itself feels alive, as though it is breathing, though the breath does not belong to lungs or to any familiar body from the surface world. It is the breath of microbial metabolism, of chemical exchange unfolding endlessly in silence. Amid those microbial coatings, pale cave snails begin to appear, nearly translucent against the sulfur-stained stone. They crawl across the white slime with extreme slowness, every millimeter of movement seeming carefully rationed to conserve energy. Their reduced pigmentation almost disappears against the pale sulfur surfaces surrounding them. They do not search for algae or plant matter like surface snails. Their entire feeding strategy depends on bacterial films and sulfur biomass coating the wet rock. Tiny radulas scrape away microbial layers with agonizing patience, leaving behind delicate feeding trails like stitches cut across living slime. Around the edges of the microbial mats, tiny crustaceans graze almost weightlessly in the black water. Protozoa feed on dissolved organics and drifting microbial particles suspended through the water column. Nematodes survive within the wet sediment and soft bacterial layers below. Every level of the food web here begins not with sunlight, but with chemistry. Sulfur-feeding microbes sustain the smallest grazers. Those tiny bodies, in turn, become food for spiders, cave fish, and deeper predators hidden farther within the darkness. Forests no longer sit at the foundation of this ecosystem. Algae no longer define productivity. Sunlight itself has almost been replaced entirely by sulfur chemistry and microbial metabolism. As the view slowly widens beyond the bacterial mats and sulfur pools below, the entire chamber no longer resembles a familiar cave system of the modern Earth. It feels more like a primordial biosphere existing before forests, before oxygen-rich skies, before the surface world became what humanity now remembers. Here, darkness is not merely the absence of light. It is an active chemical engine sustaining life through reactions far older and slower than human memory itself. But deeper beneath the sulfur films, The water itself begins to change, turning acidic enough to dissolve stone, and life continues even there. The sulfur pools gradually disappear into darkness, giving way to a deeper cave system where water no longer simply flows through stone, but slowly dissolves the walls surrounding it. The passages narrow before suddenly opening into sulfuric drip chambers coated in recrystallized minerals. The ceilings glimmer faintly beneath pale gypsum crystals, mixed with yellow-gray sulfur crusts spreading across fractured limestone. Acidic condensates gather overhead in thick droplets, heavier than ordinary water, then fall into the darkness in slow, steady rhythms like an ancient chemical clock operating far beyond human time. The water below is nearly black. It does not reflect light the way surface rivers do. Instead, it absorbs everything around it into a deep mineral darkness rich with sulfate compounds and constantly shifting acidic microzones threading through the current. From deep sulfidic groundwater far beneath the earth, hydrogen sulfide rises silently through invisible fractures in the stone. When that gas meets the thin oxygen lingering in the cave atmosphere, or passes through microbial communities coating the walls, the chemistry begins reshaping the cave itself. Sulfur slowly transforms into sulfuric acid. Limestone can no longer hold its structure. The rock begins dissolving from within, slowly enough to appear motionless to human eyes, yet continuously across thousands of years without pause. The walls here no longer feel solid. They appear wet, soft, almost as if they are decaying beneath a dull, reflective layer, resembling metal left to oxidize for centuries. In other places, entirely new minerals begin crystallizing across the surface, making the cave feel like a body simultaneously decaying and rebuilding itself within the same movement. Acid droplets fall from the ceiling into sulfur pools below, creating hollow, delicate sounds instantly swallowed by darkness. The silence is so complete that every drop feels like a measure of geological time itself. In many regions, sulfuric acid has reacted with limestone long enough to transform the stone into soft gypsum, far easier to dissolve. These passages are not shaped by flowing water alone, but by living chemistry continuously rewriting the cave's architecture from within. The walls are no longer passive scenery surrounding the ecosystem. They have become part of the underground metabolism itself. Across sulfur crusts and mineral-heavy films, extremophile microbial communities spread in shimmering layers. They resemble nothing familiar from the surface world. Acid-loving microbes survive within oxygen-poor acidic water, clinging to stone through soft, slimy biofilms that spread like living tissue. Some zones grow so acidic they approach the biological limits humanity has ever documented, with pH levels nearing those of industrial acid. Yet even within conditions seemingly incapable of supporting life, sulfur-oxidizing bacteria continue to survive alongside archaea and tiny fungi woven into the mineral slime. Snotted biofilms hang from walls and ceilings like soft structures dripping acid into the darkness below. Their colors shift between pale white, faded yellow, dull orange, and silver gray, reflecting weakly through the cave's thick moisture. Their surfaces resemble metallic skin more than organic tissue, as though the microbes themselves are coating the cave in a new layer of living corrosion. The line between mineral and biology begins to disappear. The cave walls seem to be rewritten by microorganisms through acid alone, within the less toxic transition zones, where acidity weakens just enough for other life forms to survive. Acid-tolerant worms appear along the edges of the streams. They feed on microbial residue and dissolved organic particles drifting through the darkness. Tiny arthropods move slowly across mineral films, avoiding prolonged contact with the acidic surfaces. A few cave snails graze carefully across biofilm-coated stone within rare, safer microzones. They are not the center of this ecosystem. Their fragile presence feels more like a reminder that even inside poisonous chemistry, life still searches for the narrowest margins of stability. Darkness no longer carries the feeling of an ordinary cave wilderness. It resembles an ancient biochemical landscape where chemistry, water, and microbes operate together like a slow planetary system hidden beneath the earth. Acid droplets continue falling into the pools with sharp, cold echoes. Mineral films shimmer faintly, like surfaces melting in extreme slow motion. Massive layers of microbial colonies spread across sulfur crusts, trapping tiny gas bubbles between sheets of biofilm like breath suspended inside mineral slime. There are no fish, no plants, only acid streams rippling softly through darkness, where water touches limestone every second without rest. And within that nearly invisible motion, the cave slowly changes the shape of itself. This ecosystem does not merely adapt to extremes, it actively transforms the environment itself. Biology has become a geological force. Water, microbes, and minerals sculpt the darkness together until the underground begins behaving like a slow planetary metabolism, isolated from the world of sunlight above. Within those poisoned waters, where stone continuously dissolves and sunlight has never entered, the cave begins to resemble a world no longer entirely of earth. The final chambers no longer resembled familiar cave passages. The documentary drifted past sulfur pools, quietly steaming beneath thick darkness, past slow acid rivers flowing like chemical fractures, opening deep inside the ancient earth, past microbial chambers where every surface of stone was coated in soft, slick biofilms that looked almost alive beneath the weak exploration light. Along the low mineral ceilings, condensation gathered endlessly before falling as slow acid droplets, leaving pale yellow stains across the folded limestone. In many places, the dark water appeared almost perfectly still, disturbed only by faint tremors moving beneath the cloudy surface through invisible sulfur currents. This world no longer belonged to large animals. The bats were gone. The cave fish no longer crossed the underground rivers. Life revealed itself mostly through texture now. Microbial mats stretched across the rock like ancient mosses that had never needed sunlight. Sulfur slimes clung to the walls in pale white and cloudy yellow layers, like living tissue breathing slowly inside the dark. Acidic biofilms spread around mineral cracks, where toxic chemistry leaked quietly from deep inside the stone. Entire ecosystems survived here, almost completely cut off from the surface world, sustained not by photosynthesis, but by chemistry itself, by hydrogen sulfide, methane, and invisible inorganic gradients flowing silently through the earth for thousands of years. Sulfur bacteria became the primary producers of this underground world. They oxidized sulfur compounds for energy much the same way surface plants absorbed sunlight. In many acidic chambers, the water carried a pH low enough to resemble a chemical burn for most surface organisms. Yet extremophil microbes continued thriving along sulfur-rich walls with a persistence that felt almost non-biological. Thin living membranes rippled softly beneath the slow acid currents, spreading across the mineral skeleton of the planet itself. Across the surface of those microbial films, tiny cave snails moved at speeds almost impossible for the human eye to detect. Their feeding trails etched faint lines across wet stone, delicate scratches appearing and disappearing beneath constantly forming moisture. Small crustaceans crawled slowly through sulfur biomass and chemical detritus, harvesting microbial productivity as though grazing across a meadow that had never once seen the sun. Every movement inside this ecosystem unfolded at a reduced rhythm, careful, economical, almost unwilling to disturb the darkness around it. Life here survived not through abundance, but through persistence. Above ground, nearly every ecosystem begins with sunlight. Forests absorb light and transform it into leaves, seeds, oxygen, and food webs stretching across countless living layers. But inside these deep chemical caves, chemistry replaced the role of the sun. Sulfur-consuming bacteria created nutrients from hydrogen sulfide, and those nutrients continued feeding small invertebrates, cavefish, and microbial consumers throughout the endless dark. Darkness here was no longer an absence of energy. It was a chemically active environment, a biosphere driven by invisible reactions instead of daylight. Life in these chambers was smaller, slower, and harder to see, yet no less real. These cave systems began to reveal something ancient about the planet itself, a memory from a time when life on Earth may have existed before forests, before surface oxygen, before seasons ever changed beneath the sky. Deep within the crust, rock-hosted habitats still generated inorganic energy through silent redox gradients hidden inside stone, in places completely separated from photosynthetic worlds. Microorganisms continued sustaining themselves through chemistry alone. And here, the cave systems started to resemble subterranean planets more than caves. No dramatic science fiction was needed, no alien landscapes from distant worlds. The mere existence of these ecosystems was enough to change the familiar understanding of life itself. Life did not necessarily require forests. It did not require skies. It did not need daylight or surface seasons to continue through deep time. Bacterial mats drifted gently beneath sulfur currents, like living tissue suspended in complete darkness. Acid droplets continued falling steadily from the low ceilings, creating hollow, wet echoes that carried far through the limestone chambers. Between the long silences, only bubbling water, damp resonance, and the slow movement of underground currents remained. Along the microbial colonies, crystal growths formed reflective mineral layers beneath weak exploration lights, like frozen chemical skin covering the ancient cave walls. Then the narration began to thin out. Darkness lingered longer between moments of movement. The entire sulfur ecosystem no longer appeared as a single cave chamber, but as an underground biosphere completely detached from sunlight, a biological world existing parallel to surface Earth, while following an entirely different logic of survival. And as the documentary moved deeper into that stillness, the question itself began to change. It was no longer asking what could survive underground. Now, among microbial rivers and sulfur chambers, still breathing through ancient darkness. The question became something slower, larger, and lonelier. Perhaps life had never needed as much from the surface world as humans once believed. Perhaps the sun, the sky, forests, and the seasons were only one of countless ways biology had chosen to exist, while deep beneath all of it, the earth continued breathing in darkness, and life, pale and patient, endured beside it without ever needing to see the sun. The final journey did not begin by returning toward the cave entrance, nor did sunlight reclaim the frame as some kind of release. It began in the deepest places the darkness had hidden since the opening moments of the documentary itself. Inside sulfur chambers where black groundwater rested motionless like oil. Within microbial passages coated in thin white films quietly spreading across stone. Through limestone corridors so vast that even the sound of falling water seemed ancient by the time it echoed back. And across recycled guano floors, still holding the warmth of decomposition from ecosystems that had never once seen the sky. Underground water reflected no clouds. It carried none of the blue color of daylight. It held only faint exploration light, pale microbial sheen, and drifting sulfur haze hovering above the surface like a living mist moving in slow motion. Along the cave walls, white microbial films spread like biological tissue across ancient stone. Sulfur slime clung to the dark wet fractures. Mineral condensation formed and vanished according to timescales human life could barely perceive. The sounds of the forest were gone. No birds called from the surface, no rain touched leaves above the world overhead. Only distant dripping echoed through hidden fractures. Faint bat sounds dissolved into endless depth. Sulfur bubbling rose quietly beneath acidic water, and low cave resonance moved slowly through the earth like the breathing of something ancient. Silence here was not emptiness. It was a complete environment, a sensory medium every underground organism had learned to navigate long before humans understood what true darkness really meant. Not all life requires sunlight to survive. Some cave ecosystems still depend indirectly on the surface world through guano, dead insects, dissolved organic matter, or flood debris carried underground during distant storms. But deeper still, inside chemical caves isolated for millions of years, entire food webs continue existing through chemistry alone. Sulfur molecules become oxidized. Ammonia transforms into energy. Nitrite sustains invisible microbial communities active in absolute darkness. There, chemosynthetic bacteria become the primary producers of an entire biosphere that no longer needs the sun. Darkness therefore ceased being merely the absence of light. It became an environmental condition capable of sustaining its own ecosystems, shaping its own evolution, and creating biological worlds powered by chemistry rather than photosynthesis. Cave-adapted creatures were not lesser versions of surface animals. In many ways, they were more precise for the worlds they inhabited. Across hundreds of thousands of generations without light, eyes slowly became unnecessary. Pigment lost its purpose where color no longer existed. Fast movement consumed too much energy inside nutrient-poor environments. In their place, antennae lengthened. Lateral line systems grew more refined. Chemical sensing expanded. Mechanoreception became sensitive to the smallest vibration in water or air. Skin sensitivity and hydrodynamic perception replaced what vision once handled on the surface. A blind cavefish drifted through black water without touching stone. It required no visual confirmation to understand the space around it. An orm remained nearly motionless within cold currents, its external gills pulsing so slowly it felt as though time itself moved differently inside that pale body. A nearly transparent Kentucky cave shrimp glided through cave water while its antennules constantly tasted, touched, and smelled the surrounding current. Along a narrower passage, a predatory cave spider remained perfectly still, waiting for vibration instead of sight. And beneath all of those small living bodies, chemosynthetic bacteria continued existing as the true foundation itself, not as background organisms, but as living chemistry spreading through sulfur slime, microbial films, and the biological structure of the underground world. In darkness, the world did not disappear. It simply shifted into different languages. Pressure replaced horizons. Chemistry replaced color. Echo replaced distance. Vibration replaced visible motion. Touch replaced light. The final moments moved slowly. Inside the deepest sulfur chamber, the narration fell silent for several long seconds. Only sulfur bubbles rose from the black water. Acid drips fell from the stone ceiling, and nearly invisible microbial movement continued spreading across wet surfaces. By now, the documentary had traveled too far from sunlight to retain any familiar sense of the surface world. The images that followed did not feel like a recap. A guano beetle burrowed through thick layers of decomposition. A cave cricket stood motionless against a wet limestone wall. A shrimp disappeared into underwater darkness. Blind cavefish crossed black currents. The orm remained suspended there, like a body preserved from geological time, older than human memory itself. Each organism existed as evidence that darkness could create forms of life so unfamiliar they seemed almost alien to surface perception. A nearly empty passage stretched ahead. Only thin fungal traces remained across the stone, pale microbial sheen, and the repeated sound of distant water. Cave time was not measured by day or night. It was measured by water rise, nutrient arrival, decomposition, microbial bloom, and waiting periods far beyond human biological rhythms. As the camera continued deeper forward, no clear daylight ever fully reclaimed the frame. The underground world continued existing behind the viewer without needing witnesses, without audiences, without sunlight to prove that it was alive. Then the sound slowly began to fade. Echoes stretched thinner and farther apart. A small distant patch of light may have appeared somewhere at the far end of the passage, but it never reclaimed the frame entirely. The ending kept the viewer suspended between light and darkness, as though the surface world above was only one of many environments life had ever learned to survive within. The final climax did not come from revealing a creature. It came from reversing perception itself. Humans had never entered a dead place. We had only briefly passed through a living system governed by entirely different rules. In that world, silence was environment. Darkness was selective force. Chemistry was food. Isolation was evolutionary history. And light was merely a distant condition many organisms had never once needed in order to know they were alive. From cave crickets to bats, from guano beetles to blind cavefish, from pale orms to microbial films spreading through sulfur water, Life did not always require brightness, color, speed, or skies. Sometimes life only needed a narrow water fissure inside stone, a few sulfur molecules, fragments of guano falling from darkness above, tiny vibrations moving through water, and enough time for darkness to stop being fear and become home. There is no sunrise waiting beneath the earth, only stone, water, chemistry, and the patient movement of bodies that never needed the sun to know they were alive.